Hello and welcome again. Together with political scientist Professor Mangott and my colleague Alexander Stipsitz, we will analyze the situation in Kazakhstan and we'll check up on what happened in Ukraine since our last conversation in December. And of course, we will have a look at the NATO-Russia talks, which took place last week. We'll start with Kazakhstan, maybe some information. In the beginning, it's the biggest country after Russia of the former Soviet Union countries. It's the biggest country in Central Asia. It has more than 30 times the size of Austria, but only twice as many people. Its economy relies heavily on gas and oil exports. About 30 to 40% of the oil that we use in Austria comes from there. And the Austrian company OMV is very active there. The GDP is a bit over 1/3 of the Austrian GDP. And as we heard from the news, it's an autocracy. It was governed until 2019 by former President Nasarbajew, and now his predecessor Toqajew is governing there. And all the fuss started with a rise in gas prices. And then, people started to revolt, and maybe Professor Mangott, we can start from there. What happened then? Or was this really the reason why people revolted?
I'd say that the increase in gas prices and petroleum prices was the trigger of an unrest that had been brewing already for quite a while. The situation in the economic and social situation in Kazakhstan is very poor. The economy is in a recession now, primarily due to the pandemic, the corona pandemic. Real wages are going down. Inflation is very, very high. And above all, the revenues that Kazakhstan as a state gets from oil, gas, and uranium exports actually is not distributed evenly among the members of the society. But what we have is a small number of people who have enriched themselves enormously, particularly the cronies of former President Nasarbajew and Nasarbajew himself, and people are, of course, upset that the leaders are gaining in wealth, whereas their own social situation is getting poorer by the year. So it was the trigger, but what's interesting is that in some parts of Kazakhstan, particularly in the west, where these protests started, they remained peaceful. But in Almaty, the former capital of Kazakhstan, we had a huge, violent unrest by people looting, burning down buildings, cars, and what have you. And this leads us to think that the first arena of the riots is just one of two arenas. The other arena is an elite infighting. It seems that members of the Nasarbajew clan have tried to use the current situation of disappointment, disaffection, and unrest to increase and improve their political position in Kazakhstan. Nasarbajew and his relatives, it seems most likely, have used this situation and have caused the violent unrest in Almaty. So it was an elite infighting that used social disappointment and dissatisfaction to settle scores. Ultimately, however, it seems that Toqajew, the longtime loyalist of Nazarbayev and president of Kazakhstan since 2019, has prevailed. And he has prevailed also primarily due to the support, the military support of a Russian-led defense alliance, the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization.
Could I just ask a question that has, I think, some impact for Russia, not only Russia, but Russia in this situation? I have spoken to some people in Prague who are from the region, and they said that one aspect that is rarely talked about is the situation of Islam and the Muslim population in these countries. Could you say something to that? Because in general, as we know, over the last 2 decades, there have been several terrorist attacks in various places that we don't hear about, in Moscow, famous ones. Is there a brewing conflict in that direction having to do with the Muslim populations generally that threatens Russia and may have something to do with the situation as well?
Well, actually, in Kazakhstan, we don't find any political Islamic radicalism. It's different in other countries of Central Asia, like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, or Kyrgyzstan, neighboring countries of Kazakhstan. Of course, the relevance of Muslim beliefs has increased over the past 30 years, but it's not a radical version of Islam, but a rather traditional interpretation of Islam without any aspects of political Islamization. But what we have seen over the past 30 years is that ethnic Kazakh nationalism has been on the rise. And we have seen frictions between ethnic Kazakhs and the strong Russian-speaking or ethnic Russian minority, which makes up about 20% of the population of Kazakhstan. So we do have some frictions between the two people. They are increasing, though I do not expect these frictions to turn into anything like an inter-ethnic conflict in Kazakhstan. This was also one of the factors that Russia had to consider. That Russian troops stayed longer than they have. They are about to be withdrawn in the next 2 days. Then this divide between ethnic Russians and ethnic Kazakhs could have become stronger and more difficult and more dangerous. But as we see, Russia has stationed its troops for roughly 2 weeks, and that's all troops will be withdrawn, as I said, in 2 days.
This activity and support from Russia has been seen in Russia as a very successful operation. It in and out, and they achieved their objectives. How would you say the majority of the Kazakh population views this? Is the majority, can we expect there to be now a peaceful period, or was this just an intermittent flaring that might go up again rather soon?
Well, actually, we don't have any polling data about how the Kazakh population saw the Russian intervention. We still have to wait for that. But it's definitely clear the stabilization that has been achieved over the past days could be only of a temporary nature. If the current leadership of Kazakhstan, if Mr. Toqajew and his government do not actually go ahead with long-needed reforms, political and particularly economic reforms, guaranteeing a fairer distribution of wealth in the country, guaranteeing a more supportive state for the Kazakh population. I guess Toqajew has realized that he has finally managed to stay in power with outside help as well, as I've said, but he can stay in power only if he brings about what he has promised since 2019, namely structural reforms for the country. Otherwise, I think the unrest could reappear, and the whole problem could start from the very beginning. What we have seen so far, however, is that Toqajew has been able to disempower various members of the former leading Nasarbajew clan. So in this regard, he has stabilized his position. Well, Russia was quite happy with the mission of the CSTO to Kazakhstan, because for the first time, the CSTO was engaging on such a mission, and doing so now in Kazakhstan has proved that this alliance is alive and well. The Russians have been careful not to get their troops or troops of other allied partners in the alliance to get involved in clamping down on the protests. What the Russians and other forces have done is only securing strategic infrastructure, but they did not get involved in fighting against the militants on the street, which would have been or could have potentially been very disastrous, because this would have been interpreted, I guess, by quite many Kazakhs as an interference in domestic affairs that they would not want to respect. But it was sufficient for these allied forces to be present, guaranteeing the safety of critical infrastructure, because Russian involvement sent a signal to the Kazakh security forces that Russia is behind Toqajew, that Russia is supporting Toqajew, and that convinced the security force in Kazakhstan to remain loyal to the leadership, to remain loyal to the government. So that was a second major contribution of this CSTO intervention in Kazakhstan.
Chris, do you have a, yeah, please.
Is there any indication for foreign interference? Because I'm quite sure that Russia always looks for indications that someone meddled before the revolution started, or before the revolt started. It's not a revolution. Is there any indication?
Not so far as I've seen. Well, of course, the Kazakh government of Toqajew immediately claimed that up to 20,000 foreign terrorists and bandits, as we call them, have attacked Kazakhstan. So they have portrayed the unrest as something that other countries have organized and triggered in Kazakhstan. However, he has never said which country he is speaking about, and he has never presented any evidence. The Russians, of course, have followed this line of argumentation of Toqajew, because the CSTO can act on the territory of its member states only if there's a threat from abroad, a threat to the national security and territorial integrity of a CSTO member. So Russia has also claimed, yes, it was foreign interference. And Russia has spoken about what they have been afraid about for 20 years, namely that this has been another effort in a colored revolution, namely bringing down a Russia-friendly government in a neighboring country of Russia. And what was surprising and interesting is that the Russian leadership, or parts of Russia's leadership, argued that in the future, these armed forces of the CSTO will be used to prevent such color revolutions in any member country of the alliance.
I have one from my side concluding question. What concerns me about this situation, and what surprised me about it, and colleague Chris has mentioned it, is our dependence, or not dependence, our deep connections in the energy sector, and to what degree a country like Austria has connections in Kazakhstan due to their resources. Now, you just pointed at the possibility, if these reforms do not take place now that were promised, that this volatility will continue. What would you advise to the Austrian government, or subsequently also to the Europeans in general, considering this dependency on energy, which is of course then going into the Russian question as well?
Of course, some normative people in government and in academia or in the NGO sector argue that you should not trade with an authoritarian country. Kazakhstan indeed is an autocracy. However, I don't think this leads us very far, because if, say, Austria stops trading with Kazakhstan, others will trade with Kazakhstan and fill Austria's place. And what is relevant geopolitically for the whole of the European Union, if you put sanctions on Kazakhstan, or if you limit trade or cut off trade, you're pushing Kazakhstan into the arms of Russia and China. And that, of course, is not in the geopolitical interest of the European Union. So cutting off trade is not a solution to anything. It would just be, well, something that pleases a normative attitude to international politics and foreign policy. I don't consider it wise to do so.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, then maybe we go to the next topic, Ukraine. In December, we already spoke about the conflict, the brewing conflict. Back then you said it's about 50-50 if that this conflict can become a war. What would you say today? Where are we standing today?
Well, I think we are closer to a military escalation, because what we have seen over the past week, the talks between Russia and the United States, the NATO-Russia meeting and the meeting at the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe in Vienna is that what we had expected, the West is not inclined to give in to any of the most important demands of the Russian side for security guarantees for Russia. As we have spoken then, Russia is demanding a lot of things, but basically they are asking for NATO not to expand any further. They are demanding that NATO rescinds its membership promise to Georgia and Ukraine, and it also asks that NATO withdraws its soldiers and its military infrastructure from the territory of East European NATO member states. For NATO, this is unacceptable. Doing so would cause a problem of credibility for the alliance, and of course would weaken all the power and influence that the alliance has gained over the past 30 years by expanding the military alliance. So we have had now these talks, and what the West has tried to do was to offer Russia some concessions in, well, less important areas, namely arms control and trust-building measures, particularly as far as military exercises are concerned. But the Russian side has made clear that these are issues of secondary importance, and they want a response by the West to the demands that I've mentioned a couple of minutes ago. And the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has said the Russians are expecting such a written response very quickly within a week. So what does it tell us about the chances for a military escalation in Ukraine? Well, if the Russians don't get their will, say if Putin actually does not succeed with his foreign policy initiative, then of course he is in a difficult situation. What will he do next? Will he say, well, I've tried my best, I did not succeed, so okay, let's close this dossier, which of course will mean that he loses face both within Russia and abroad? Or will he then be forced to respond in an escalatory manner? And this could as well be a cyber maneuver or cyber operation by the Russians, which would be the mildest form of escalation, up to a large military escalation on the territory of Ukraine. And so today I would say the probability that we will see some form of military escalation by Russia against Ukraine is now at about 75%.
Okay.
You up me by 5%. That scares me a little bit, I have to say. So I go with you on that. And maybe let's peel a few things off that rotten orange concerning Europe. The couple of interesting things that I've been following is, for example, the Ukrainians seem to be rather upset with the Germans because the Germans have been continuously refusing to send weapons. Is that's really for me interesting. Do you think the Germans can continue that and will continue that? And by doing so, that again has something to do with the German-Russian connection due to energy? Are the Germans trying to stay out of it as best as they can?
With the new government, I think they will change.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Yeah, but so far they have not been complied with the Ukrainian demands.
Actually, there's no united position of relevant German political parties. The CDU, CSU, the former Chancellor's party, is now arguing for delivering lethal weapons to Ukraine for defense purposes, as they argue. While they were in government, they were opposed to such an idea. So you quite frankly see how positions change if you're in government or if you're out of government, because the situation in Ukraine has not changed over the past months. So there's no argument to bolster the change in the position of the CDU, CSU, but the German government itself is divided. Already during the election campaign, the co-leader of the Green Party, Mr. Habeck, has argued after a visit to Ukraine that Germany should send lethal weapons to Ukraine to help it defend itself against continuing Russian aggression, and also the Liberal Party, the FDP inside the government, is close to this position of delivering weapons. The SPD, the party of the Chancellor, however, at least most of the members of the leading bodies of the SPD are opposed to sending weapons. But on this position, of course, the pressure on SPD is on the Social Democrats is growing inside the government, outside the government, and particularly from abroad, from other NATO allies and the United States. They have to see that the Chancellor Scholz will be steadfast on the issue and will prevail within the government. It will be very difficult for him. Of course, sending lethal weapons to Ukraine would further strain the already difficult relations between Germany and Russia. And the SPD in the government is already under pressure by its coalition partners to stop another very relevant project, namely the gas pipeline between Russia and Germany, Nord Stream 2. This is domestic pressure that is mounting on the Social Democrats. There's a lot of pressure from abroad, particularly from the United States. The European Union and the West in general has always criticized Russia for using gas relations, gas trading relations for political reasons. Now it's the other way around, because what the Western position is now, and the German government has to be convinced about it, is that the West argues as a deterrence element vis-a-vis Russia, that if Russia escalates in Ukraine militarily, then Nord Stream 2 would be stopped, and there will not be a conclusion of the certification process for this gas pipeline. So a couple of years after the gas crisis we had in the 2000s, now the West is using gas trade for political reasons as well, and they are asking the German government, and this of course concerns mainly the Social Democrats, to make a public statement to make Russia aware of the fact that Germany would indeed stop the certification process if there is any new aggression by Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Dries, could I tag on because that the Polish government has said, or some speakers of the government have said that Europe is closest to a major war on its territory than in the last 30 years. That didn't surprise me. What I didn't see coming in the last days is that Sweden is particularly worried. Could you enlighten us to that situation vis-a-vis Sweden, which is a neutral country, as far as I know, and what's going on there, and Russian ships in close to their seas, and so on and so forth. Why Sweden?
Well, I don't think that there will be a military attack on Sweden by Russia on the island Gotland, which is widely discussed at the moment. But there are analysts and there are politicians who think that Russia might not only escalate vis-a-vis Ukraine, but could escalate further, including Western countries or the Baltic nations, for that matter. I don't think that's very realistic, but there are forces in Sweden, like in Finland, who are thinking quite openly about joining NATO. And I think all the fuss they are now making about the potential Russian aggression against Sweden or Finland is used by these forces to make their cause more supported by the populations of these two countries, which are quite skeptical about joining the Western military alliance. So I think a lot of fuss about something that will not materialize as a military threat.
Especially Finland had quite an ongoing, relation with Russia.
Well, there's
past 30 years, where they have 1,300 kilometers of border to them,
and a lot of wars in the past.
They always try to stay, and they had a war in the past, but they always try to stay neutral, more or less, between NATO and Russia. And now the Prime Minister openly was thinking about whether or not a NATO closer relation to NATO would be wise or not. So this is quite a big move, I would say, for such a country.
Well, actually, Russia is threatening military means to oppose Western interests and to enforce its own interests. So from the point of view of Finland or Sweden, it's understandable that they are considering more than ever before that joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, joining NATO would help protect their security. I don't see it threatened immediately or in the foreseeable future, but security policy, of course, is always to take care about what might happen tomorrow. So I think the discussion will intensify with a military escalation in Ukraine. However, I think it would be a very detrimental development. Bringing in Sweden and Finland into NATO would actually increase the fear of Russia of being encircled. It would then actually be encircled by NATO. It will not be a contribution to de-escalate the situation in Europe, but it would be a contribution to cause a major iron divide of the European continent, with the western part and Russia on the other side. And given all the long-term tradition of Swedish and Finnish policy on well, balancing and contributing to a more comprehensive security architecture in Europe would be gone, and that would be a loss, I think, for the European Union. Would increase actually the number of NATO countries in the European Union from 21 to 23 out of 27. So NATO and EU members would become more and more the same.
And yet, Europe didn't really take a big part of the talks of last week.
No.
I have to say, it was just Russia and United States.
Well, actually, it was very tragic to see how the head of the foreign and security policy, or the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union, Borrell, actually asked for and pleaded for the European Union to get involved in these talks. But nobody, neither the United States nor Russia, wants the European Union as an institution to play any role in this process. For the Russians, the reason is that they don't see the European Union as an independent actor. What they see the European Union as is a vassal of the United States, and they say the European Union actually is always implementing what the United States is asking them to do. So what sense does it make to talk to a vassal? Let's speak to the master directly. And that is what for the Russians is the major cooperation and coordination axis, namely the talks between Russia and the United States. So the European Union as an institution actually has not been taken care of, and it will not be considered as a player in this respect. And this also indicates that the European Union actually is a powerful economic player, that geopolitically the European Union is a dwarf, it's insignificant. And it doesn't seem to be the case that the Europeans will realize that in order to get more influential, they would need to get more independent from their transatlantic ties and build their own defense forces and are able to defend European territory against aggression from abroad, and also control the periphery of the European Union in terms of soft and hard security crises.
And one might add, before actually dealing with the cross-Atlantic relationship, a little bit or a lot more integration within may be helpful. No?
Absolutely. This particularly concerns foreign policy. Well, foreign policy is still a matter of consensus, which makes it very, very difficult for the European Union to take on a united position. But this is due to the fact that the interests of the various EU member countries are very different. The Eastern Europeans, the Poles, the Romanians, the Baltic nations are very eager to have the European Union take a tough position on Russia, whereas Germany, Italy, France are still in a position that they want to argue for sort of mediation and dialogue. And other countries like Spain and Portugal are not interested at all in this Eastern Europe security issue. And with such diverging interests, which we don't have only vis-a-vis Russia, but vis-a-vis other foreign policy issues and crises as well, it's very difficult to find a common position. And as long as this is the case, then the European Union will be as helpless as it has been over the past 15 to 20 years. If the recipe for changing this is majority decisions in foreign policy, however, is also not very, very clear, because you might, of course, get common positions more quickly if there's a majority decision on these issues. But what will other countries who are opposed to the majority decision do to undermine the position taken by the majority? So if majority decision-making is indeed a solution to the current problems of foreign policy decision-making in the European Union, is not all clear.
So it stands to hope that the threat that is the Damocles sword that's hanging over us right now may actually facilitate some kind of haste or at least renewed motivation of dealing with this. Chris, do you have anything specific now, or let's see?
Just one question, because it doesn't really get into my mind. What is Putin really winning if he's escalating? I mean, the army will start a war, whatever, but what is he really gaining? Apart from to the inside, to showing his own people that he's a strong leader. I mean, there's not really anything to gain for him, is there, in the long run?
Well, that's a very important question. I think that the Russian initiative taken by Vladimir Putin is a mistake. Well, if they do militarily escalate, well, they of course can demonstrate their military power.
Yeah,
and of course, destabilize the Ukrainian government of President Zelensky. And they, and it's quite important, could show that all those Western statements about protecting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity are just talk, because no NATO soldier will come to assist the Ukrainian armed forces against the military aggression by Russia. There's a very cynical saying that NATO will defend Ukrainian independence to the last Ukrainian soldier. Meaning, of course, it will be up to the Ukrainians to defend themselves. So Russia could actually demonstrate to all those countries who are interested in closer cooperation with NATO that NATO doesn't take any military action to help them. But then that's everything he can achieve. But there are very important costs to such action, not only the sanctions that have been threatened vis-a-vis Russia, economic and financial sanctions, like cutting them off from SWIFT, from putting sanctions on their loans that they are taking abroad, on the primary and the secondary market, the stop of exporting certain consumer technology to Russia, and several things as well. So this will hurt and damage the Russian economy very much, which is in recession, has been in recession for 2 years now, particularly during the corona pandemic. The social situation in Russia is also quite difficult. Real wages have gone down by 12% since 2013. Inflation is increasing, so people in Russia are dissatisfied with the development of their own household, with their own personal income situation. So if sanctions do hurt the Russian economy even more, then the pressure on the government in Russia by the people will increase. And I think this will also be the case because I don't think that the majority of Russians is actually pleased to see Russian military action against Ukraine. The argument that Putin is seeking to cause or trigger a new foreign policy crisis to bolster his image at home is not a very valid argument. Putin's portrait has been between 60 and 70% over the past 4 years, and it's not likely to decrease, and that's a sufficient support rate for Vladimir Putin. So for domestic reasons, he doesn't need military escalation. Actually, the domestic setting could become more unpleasant for Putin if he does. But besides the sanctions, there will be also another cost for Russia. The West has already announced that if Russia escalates militarily, in whatever form, Western forces in East European NATO member states will increase, and the Western military infrastructure will increase in those countries, which actually will bring potentially more threat to the Russian border than we have actually now. So actually, I do not very much understand why Putin is doing this. He, of course, knows that his demands will not be realized. The West will not actually give in on those demands for security guarantees. He can militarily escalate, but the costs will be enormous. And I don't see that the benefits will be higher than the costs.
There is an aspect, may I, that I found fascinating. You just mentioned the probable or possible exclusion of Russia from SWIFT, the bank exchange system. Now, I discovered that Russia and China have come up with their own SWIFT, the SPFS. I'm not going to do the Russian name now, but it's a similar system set up parallel. But only, I think, like 15% of those who joined it are actually using it. But it shows something very interesting, which I 10 years ago would not really have expected at all. With the upcoming China-Russian talks, could there be a scenario where there is an alliance that is strengthening between Russia and China vis-a-vis the West, so that we have a situation with all this Southern Sea, China situation, and Russia actually be getting closer to each other. And this situation now is also a little bit of signaling, a step forward in provoking the West. Could that be? What do you say about the China-Russian talks that are coming up, or that are constantly happening, but official ones are coming up? What is this new friendship all about, or possible friendship?
Well, this relationship has been strengthening and deepening for the past 15 years, and particularly since 2014, after the annexation of Crimea and Western sanctions on Russia and the West's effort to isolate Russia politically and diplomatically. The relationship has deepened a lot, with Russia being more dependent now on China. If Western sanctions go ahead as announced, then Russia would become even more dependent on China, which actually is something that I do not see as a benefit for Russia, because the Russians have always been very proud of their ability to remain sovereign and have freedom of action and decision. If they move closer to China even more, then that sovereignty of decision-making will decrease a bit. But definitely we would see another step in strengthening the ties. I don't expect a military alliance to be formed, but there's a close military cooperation between the two. There are common political and diplomatic positions, and there is, of course, the trade between the two countries, which is relevant to both of them. So we will see, yes, definitely a further alignment of Russia and China, not a military alliance, because the Chinese have no interest to get entangled in Russian potential military conflicts and the other way around. But yes, the alliance will get stronger. And that, of course, raises the question that has been debated by the academia over the past years, namely, is it wise to push Russia further into the arms of China if the West identifies China as the major competitor and rival of the West in the future, particularly as far as Chinese-US rivalry is concerned? Will the West, and particularly the United States, be able to balance both Russia and China if they go together even more? Or will it be more difficult to do so? Would it be relevant, as John Mearsheimer, a prominent realist thinker, argues, to try to find avenues for getting Russia closer to the West again? Well, there is this debate. Some say we have the West has the power to balance both. Others are arguing for breaking this close ties between Russia and China. I myself, I do think that it would be wise to get Russia closer to the West, but I don't see any chances in the foreseeable future for such a development. There's nothing the West can offer Russia which would be of greater benefit for Russia than its relationship with China.
Okay. I have one more. If you want to end it, then guys, then let's end it. But I have a meta question. You can cut the preludium later. Dear Professor Mangott, it's not entertaining when the drums of war are sounding, but at the same time, there's a dynamic. And anyone who's ever been concerned with politics and has a passion for it, this dynamic is similar and has been similar at least since Rome, at least since it's been well documented, and it has a lot to do with lying or we could say propaganda that works internally on the populations in the respective countries, and then there's what is going towards the outside. But the reason why I'm saying this is Dmitry Peskov, the speaker of the Kremlin, said, I think only yesterday, that they would never attack. Only a mad person could imagine Russia taking military steps, but they would absolutely immediately retaliate against any adverse move against Russia. Now, is there any chance that we will ever know, or where do you go as an expert for the sources? Because media apparently cannot be trusted, for what is going on now. So there's been news in the US recently. There have already been cyber attacks. There's been this very special attack apparently in the Ukraine already. So that is giving us pause and saying what's going on. The Russia at the same time is saying this is happening against them. So the long and short of the question is, can we know, and it might be only academic after the fact, but can we know who is doing what now? Is everyone provoking everyone, or is there a clear side that is currently trying to provoke a military situation?
Well, it's very difficult because we, as you have said, have propaganda on all fronts with all the parties involved in this crisis. And of course, there's a lot of Russian propaganda. And if Peskov argues that Russia does not have any plans to launch military aggression against Ukraine, and the question is, what would be the military technical response that Putin has announced last December if the West does not actually accept Russian demands? So what kind of response will we see against which country? Isn't it very likely that that response will affect Ukrainian territorial integrity? But as I said, a lot of propaganda. Honestly, as an expert, we can try to have as many sources available, many sources of information available to come to a conclusion. But at the end of the day, it's always educated guess. It remains speculation. It would be honest, and I want to be that honest, to say that actually we don't know. Experts don't know what Russia will do. The United States doesn't know what Russia will do. Only the Russian leadership, and I think only a very small group of people in the Russian leadership do know what could potentially happen if these talks between Russia and the West fail, which is most likely at the moment. So we don't know a lot of stuff about this crisis, and there will be an element surprise for all of us. So what an academic analyst can do is only to use the experience he or she has on Russia and the region, and analyze the public statements and the actions taken on the ground, and use all the sources one has established, in this case with Russian politicians, diplomats, and bureaucrats, to get at least some information about what might be the case in Ukraine after the failure of the talks.
Thank you. So I hope we don't have to dust off our fallout shelters, and yeah, I hope next time we meet, we're down to 50-50 again.
Let's hope so.
Hopefully, yeah. Okay, then, if there's no further input, I would say we conclude the session for today. Thank you for taking your time, for participating. Thank you all for watching, and we will see you again in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, до свидания.
До свидания.